Here we are at beautiful Horsetail Falls, once again in the beautiful Columbia River Gorge, here on the Flaming Brain podcast. Now, if you've already seen episode 6, that's all about Turtle Island itself, where I built my submarine. So now here, part 2, this is all about building my submarine. So, because I built it, believe it or not, on a 500-acre island, literally in the middle of nowhere in Fiji. And it was the first time I had ever tried to build anything out of fiberglass. So it was amazing I completed it. But going back to the beginning, when I was about 6 years old, I think, or 8 years old, I saw this movie about exploring the undersea world and these little radical flying saucer shaped submarines, and I was hooked. And then in 1978, I saw this magazine that had the plans to build a little one-man semi-submersible that would take a single person just to an eye level depth of 3 or 4 feet below the surface, where those floats would remain on the top of the water, and as you can see, the sub would be suspended just beneath the waves. I immediately saw this and said, that's got to be a 2-man, and you got to put him in tropical resorts. So I began working on this concept in 78, and for 8 years, I toiled away making models, doing drawings, figuring it out. And then one day I had this incredible opportunity to go build it on Turtle Island. And that's a whole story in and of itself, but here you can see the beginning and the whole way through, because I had to first build every part as a solid form that would look exactly like the finished part. So here I built this thing, it's called a plug or a male mold, and once it's perfect, then you make a mold of it, which becomes your negative. So you go from a positive to a negative. Now that part you just saw was the cockpit right here, that's the cockpit itself. Now you can see these halves are just about ready to have molds made. And now you can see there's the beginning of the mold. And now this was the float to go on the surface that prevents it, from going any more than 5 feet underwater. There's the cockpit. And then that's the mold. And here comes the finished parts for the float. And there was a ventilation system in the float that would force fresh air down into the cockpit. Now here you can see the cockpit's finished and it's ready to be inserted into the sub and sealed in place. Now once that cockpit went in, that was it. I couldn't take it out again. It was permanently affixed, so I had to make sure everything inside the sub would never fail and never break. Then finally, after 15 months...
Fiji. The owner of the island, Richard Evanson, brought him here to build this, a 2-man recreational submarine. These are home movies of Walker's Fijian entourage giving the sub its first ceremonial bath.
It was only a surface test. We didn't submerge it yet, but it was 100% successful in what we wanted to accomplish on the surface. They've got Sony in-dash compact disc player. They've got sonar and lights for nighttime use, so they're designed for ultimate enjoyment.
Walker says the sub will be ready for the full dunking in a few weeks. After that, he plans to sell it to resort areas around the world. He already has inquiries from Australia. He expects to make money, but that's only part of it.
And realized 9 years ago I had this idea, and now here it is actually built. That is probably more fulfilling than the prospect of making money on it.
Walker is home in Portland for a few weeks, but he'll soon return to Fiji to finish his project. What will he come up with then? He hasn't had a chance to think about it lately, but he'll dream up something. Pat Cruz, News 8.
Now, even though the sub did work and it proved the concept, it was too much of a prototype to be put into service. It was never able to be used regularly, and I never could find investors. But eventually I went on to design a better one where the floats were always on the surface. As you can see here, surfaced, and here submerged. The little cockpit would swing down just beneath the surface like the other one, but with both floats always remaining on the surface of the water, it provided something that was much more stable. And once again, I never did anything, but hey, lo and behold, a couple weeks ago, I found on YouTube someone's doing the same exact idea that I had. And then this was another version, but unfortunately, I was never able to really realize any of these. And finally, after a year and a half, it was time for me to leave Turtle Island, which was bittersweet. And yeah, this was my favorite project, my little submarine. It was so cool. I was so sad that I could never build more of them and capitalize them and put them in resorts around the world. And finally, after it ended up, they made kind of a little shrine for it, and it sat here for years. But eventually the fiberglass got real bad, so they had to just sink it in the water. So I also started getting involved in building some other aquatic vehicles. This was the Sea Turtle. It was a motorized towing device, pretty much just designed to take snorkelers around that maybe were a little afraid to be out in the water without something to hang on to. And I wanted to deploy these in tropical resorts. Then there was the Dolphin Diver, and this was kind of like the Sea Turtle. This thing carried you along on the surface. It had a scuba tank and a battery, and it would supply air and water to your power wing. So on the surface, you're like this. And then when you wanted to go underwater, you could dive up to 30 feet. Then I came up with a method of using the Sea Turtle and building a dual version that had 2 scuba tanks. You can see here the components. And this would give you a much longer operating time. And then there was the torpedo. This had a spring motor, so you'd wind it up for a few minutes and it would pull you around underwater for 5 minutes. And then I had my neat little propulsion unit here. And this worked quite well. But remember, this is in the days before high-powered electric motors and lithium batteries. So this was not practical because it just didn't have the power and the battery capacity. And then I had a really cool little handheld unit. And I just worked on so many of these dang things. It's crazy.